Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat box if you can hear me. I've been doing these a lot, so it does work. Okay, good. And I know it's really early. I'm actually in my pajamas, if you notice the video's not on. So for people who don't know me, I just put together this beginning slide that gives you a little idea of who I am. And these are my kids. I have homeschooled them for, let me see, when did I start? Probably about 16, 17 years now. The oldest is right now living in Australia and finished 2 years of college by the time she was 19. And we live in California, and she actually went off to college in New York, so that was really exciting for her. She left at 17 to go to college in New York. We didn't foresee that happening until later, but it was quite an adventure for her. And then I have one who is 17, and then the baby is 13. So I've homeschooled my own kids. I also have run a learning center. It's called San Diego Liberal Arts, and I've run that for about 15 years, and that has hundreds of homeschool kids come in 1 day a week and do core academic classes as well as electives. And I have other teachers who come in and teach. My husband teaches there. He's very popular. He's super fun. And I wrote Lollipop, which focuses on love of learning, basically the ages from about 6 to 14, if you want to get as broad as possible. So those of you who are familiar with TJ Ed, love of learning, they typically say 8 to 12 years old, but I think it can go down as young as 6, depending on the child, and as old as 14. And when I started my thesis for my master's in education, I really, really liked teenagers. And so I started researching teenagers and how they learn and what kind of obstacles they face. And I kept finding over and over again that a lot of the obstacles they were facing really weren't about this typical stage that a teenager should be in as far as learning, but they were reflections of holes that they had acquired or not filled when they were younger and in this love of learning phase. So I kind of backed up and focused my research more on the needs of that younger phase because of how it would impact the kids when they were older. So even though a lot of what I'm talking about is ideally done, so if you have a 3-year-old, congratulations, you can figure this out before your kids even hit this stage. But if you have an older child and you're noticing that they are kind of resistant to what you're trying to do, a lot of times it's not about skills they need as an older learner. It's about what they may be missing as that happened when they were younger, and you can back up and kind of fix that and fill those holes. So as a basic review for any of you who don't know the book or just don't know, these are not all the Lollipop principles, but these are the ones that I'm sort of focusing on with this webinar. I come from this point of view when I teach. This is why I homeschooled my kids. This is why I offer classes, because I don't find this everywhere, and so I wanted to create it. But the first most important one is that everybody has some kind of genius within them, and they have a purpose or a mission that they were born to do. It was actually I love listening to Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist from Canada. And he talked about how people need a purpose. They need to feel like they have a purpose in life, not just a job, not just they're not just being happy or having fun, but they need to feel like there's some purpose to their life. And he cited a lot of studies in psychology that have shown that that is an important factor in somebody describing their life as happy or fulfilling. And it doesn't have to be a huge purpose. They don't have to save orphans or, starving countries. They can simply feel like what they do matters to even one person, a few people, or even just in their little realm of life. But it's very important. So I personally believe that that is true. But even if that's not part of your worldview that you necessarily believe, there is data that shows that feeling that way leads to a happier life. So even if it's not part of your spiritual or philosophical worldview that that's true, it's just beneficial to you and your kids to feel like they have a purpose, because they will have a happier life. And the next one is that the purpose of education is to create thinkers and lifelong learners who can uncover and develop their purpose. So it's not to get great scores on the SATs or to be able to name all 50 states, which I probably still couldn't do under pressure. But it is to teach them how to think and how to uncover that purpose and develop the skills in order to fulfill it. And typically they don't really start to get a good feel for what their purpose is until they are teenagers. That's not always true. I have met younger kids who really do feel their purpose, and or parents who really perceive it very early, and I've watched them over years and they're absolutely right. And so that's fantastic. I know with my 3 kids, I was really sure about one kid really early, and then one of them, probably 12, 13, I was pretty sure I knew. And there are times with my youngest that I'm no, I can't quite pin it down. So they're all different. So but they typically don't start to really see it for themselves until they are teenagers, but they have more trouble seeing it if they don't have this foundation of a love for learning, confidence that they can learn, and then basic strategies for learning. So that's the foundation we need to give them, so that when they are a little bit older and they're going a little deeper, they are able to perceive their purpose. Okie doke. So today we're going to focus on inspiring a love for learning, just like the title of the webinar said. By the way, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box. You are also welcome to unmute and ask questions. That's why I'm doing these live instead of just recording them. So you don't have to turn your camera on if you don't want to. It's up to you. But you can always, I have the chat box open too, and I peek over there from time to time. So in the future, we're going to talk more about teaching kids how to think and developing that skill, since I did say one of the purposes of education is to develop thinking. But we're going to start off by focusing on inspiring a love for learning, because that's the foundation that they need. Ideally, this is done when kids are between the ages of 6 to 14, and I'm going to just dabble a little bit in psychology in a few minutes and explain why those are the ideal ages. So if you have children in those ages or younger than those ages, then I will explain why. But do not worry if your kids are older than that or in the last few years of that and you feel like they haven't done what we were talking about today, because you can always do it, and it doesn't take as long when they're older, but it might help you identify the source of some problems and help you fix them a little bit better. So sometimes before you can fix their problems as a scholar or an older learner, you need to fix the problems that stemmed from when they were younger. And these 3 things go hand in hand. So everyone talks about they have to develop a love for learning, but I talk about in the Lollipop book that these 3 things really go hand in hand, and are happening around the same time. Developing a love for learning, building their confidence, meaning building their confidence in their own ideas, in their ability to learn, just in themselves. Not confidence in a specific purpose or mission, but confidence in the fact that they do matter, that their ideas matter, their interests matter, and that they do have a purpose that they will figure out. And then also giving them just basic learning strategies, helping them learn how to learn. So you're really empowering them for the future. These three really go hand in hand, because if you truly want to grow a love for learning, you have to feel confident and you have to have some basic strategies. If we're going to love anything, we have a lot of trouble loving anything or anyone where we feel insecure or where we have no coping mechanisms for how to interact with that person or that thing. That you'll notice typically in love in general, that if there's a problem, then there's usually one of those other two things going on there. So what does it look like? This is the number one question that I always get. Okay, great ideas. What does it actually look like? So if you are encouraging a love for learning and you are building their confidence and you're giving them strategies, part of what it looks like is you're encouraging their initiative and ingenuity. And that's important. That sounds really easy. It's harder to do than it sounds like, because a lot of times, especially if they're on the younger side, their initiative is messy and not easy to not easy for you to accommodate. So, but we want to encourage that in them, because this is it's important before they are willing to really go deep and do hard work to learn things that are really challenging. They have to feel like it's worth it, because their initiative, their crazy ideas are at least worth kind of exploring, why they like that and what's going on with that. Structuring time over content. If you are familiar with TJ Ed, you understand the key of structure time, not content. That is a huge part of helping when they're younger, with fostering that love of learning and building that confidence and strategies. But it also helps if you have older children and you're really having a struggle getting them through things. It's often very daunting to think about the content we have to get through. If you, as parents, teachers, think about when you make a to-do list and it's super long, or you are just aware of all the things you have to do, or you're cleaning the entire house in the face, and it can feel really overwhelming even to an adult. So to a child or even to a teenager, sometimes learning feels overwhelming. So if you have a child or a teenager who is procrastinating reading a book or writing a paper or doing a project or anything, even if it seems like something they would enjoy doing, if they're procrastinating starting, it's probably because either they're not sure where to start, it's overwhelming because they don't know where to start, and we're going to talk later about helping them kind of chunk things, but it's also because maybe they feel just really overwhelmed, like the whole task is overwhelming. So or it might just be that they don't necessarily think they're going to enjoy that. So one of the ways to overcome that I have found to be really successful, both with my kids and with other people's kids and with students I've had, is I structure time. So rather than saying you have to read 5 chapters before you can go and do anything else, I'll say, you know what, just sit down and just read however much you can read for the next 20 minutes. I mean, you can set the time based on the child's age and ability and resilience at that point. If you have a child who's super burnt out, you might tell them 5 minutes. If you have a child who you feel like can stretch a little bit, you could tell them, spend an hour doing that. But if you give them time instead of content, often that is less overwhelming. And you just tell them, you know what, I understand that, but how about you just, here's some math practice, just give it 20 minutes and see what you can do. And when 20 minutes is over, you can even set a timer if they're really struggling with this. And when the 20 minutes is over, then you're done and you can take a break, go play for an hour, go do whatever they do that they choose for a certain amount of time, and then they can come back and do some more for another 20 minutes. A lot of times what happens is they realize the task is not beyond them. It's not overwhelming. Also, if you don't want to set a timer, something that happens that's really cool is sometimes they will start, so maybe they'll start reading a book that they thought they would hate, or that they're already started and they're not enjoying. They'll start your 20 minutes and then they will keep going. So if you don't actually set a timer that dings, if you just say, hey, I'll tell you when 20 minutes is up, and if you go in and after 20 minutes they're still super happy, a lot of times they will exceed the time and they will keep going once they get started. So that's why that's such an important key for fostering the things that we're talking about. And then also just allow them to explore their interests, which I understand can be a lot of work for the parent, and it's very, very hard to do as a teacher in a class. You know, how do you let an entire class each individually explore their interests? I have taught group classes, and the way I did it with groups, and this may help you even if you're just homeschooling at home. If you've got even 2 kids, much less 4, 5, 6 kids, you probably have just as many interests going on. So how do you let them all explore their interests? You know, I would do some projects and some things all together, but then I would talk to them about being able to then take that project and make it their own and do their own little version of it on something that interested them. So there are ways that you can teach basic skills, but then allow them to own it and make it their own project. So those are what it looks like if you're doing those things. I like to look at this comparison, and a lot of these came from Oliver DeMille's Thomas Jefferson, his initial Thomas Jefferson education book. If you haven't read that, I very much recommend it. So this is a direct comparison of when I'm talking about inspired students versus forced students. So if your kids or your students seem to think the ideas over here under force, then that's a big clue to you that they are not feeling inspired. In other words, they are not cultivating a love for learning. They are not building their confidence. They are not learning strategies. So inspired students are feel like there is so much to learn and it's really exciting. Now, that doesn't mean they don't feel a little overwhelmed or not up to the task, because remember, we're building their confidence. They don't have confidence. It's our job to build it by giving them little successes over time. But that's different than a child or a teenager who feels like, oh, there's just so much and it's so boring. And so nothing, if they say nothing piques their interest, that's a red flag that you might need to do a little healing and go back to fostering a love for learning. Inspired students really enjoy learning and think it's a lot of fun. Forced students feel like learning is work and everything is more fun than learning. Inspired students really feel like they can learn anything either on their own, or they can take a class, or they can get with a teacher or a parent. Forced students see learning as something that only happens when they're sitting with an expert, a teacher or a parent, and being told exactly what to do. Now, these kids are learning outside of those environments, but they don't recognize that as learning. And so the word is almost a bad word to them. It has a lot of negative connotations, and we don't want it to. We want it to have a fun connotation. The really obvious ones, I love learning versus I hate learning. But also inspired students have really passionate interests, and sometimes they're crazy and sometimes they burn out really fast. It's really hard. I know as a homeschooler, there were times where my kids were so interested in stuff and I would buy books on it, or we would go to the library and we would get all this stuff, and then they weren't interested anymore like 2 weeks later, especially when they're younger. And that does happen, and you learn with your own kids, when to really invest money and when not to. But don't be discouraged. That's not a bad sign. That means that they are at least, passionate about something. It's much worse if they feel like what they think is not important or valuable, and so they lack that passion. That's something that needs to be mended. Also, inspired students they know that what's assigned is just the beginning and it's the minimum. And they know that if they do more, they'll learn more, but they'll also have more fun. Whereas force students want to know, okay, what's the minimum? You know, I can always tell the kids who don't love learning, who don't have confidence, who don't have strategies, because they're the ones who are like, so how many words does this have to be? How many pages does this have to be? And then the kids who love learning and have this foundation really solidly are the ones who are saying, well, is it okay if I do a whole 20-page story? And they're the ones I have to kind of rein in and say, hey, well, why don't you give me the outline of that, and then you keep developing that and send it to me when you're done, because I still need them to keep it manageable. Whoops, I'm going to go back because I forgot I want to make a comment on this. So I am not advocating, like I said, besides being a homeschool mom, I'm also a teacher. And I do actually work for a charter school that is part of the public school system. And so we do have required things that the kids have to do. But even as a parent, I'm not advocating that you wait around for kids to be inspired. Along with this goes the idea that you as either the parent or the teacher, your really challenging job is to figure out how to inspire them. And that's a lot of hard work. But that goes back to the 3 things. So rather than thinking, how do I inspire them? Because that is such a vague, open term. Think about, what could I do that could help them love learning? What could I do that would build their confidence? What could I do that could build their strategies? And I am going to give you some concrete ideas, but I just want to make that comment with this slide that it's not that I'm saying don't teach them if they don't want to. And I see, yeah, there's a question, and she's like, you're already answering it for me. So signs of being forced, I really do back up. So even if I know it gets a little scary when they're older because there's more pressure that they learn certain things. When they're younger, if they're not quite getting world geography, we tend to excuse that because, oh, it's okay, you can get that later. And the same parents who excuse that, when a lot of times when I work with different parents through the charter school, even the parents, it's not even the teachers, but the parents put all this pressure on the kids for, oh, well, now, you know, you're at this higher level and it's not okay that you're not getting this. I will tell you, although it makes you nervous, if you feel like they're falling into this forced category, it's okay to pull back on content, not for an entire year, but to pull back on content and focus on, okay, how can I get you to love learning? Maybe not love the exact assignment that you have, but let's just let's do something fun that you find fun to learn about. Or what kind of little activities can I set up so that they experience success, even if it's small success? Or what kind of strategies are they missing? Why does this feel overwhelming to them? Like, what strategies are they missing? And pull back a little bit. Forget the assignment for a day, a week, a month, depending on the assignment and the repercussions of setting it aside, and focus on that, and then come back to, okay, the content specific assignment that they have to get through if they do have requirements because of whatever format they're in. Okay, so I'm going to deviate a little bit and talk about, my book goes into depth about developmental stages. So what I found fascinating when I started doing research, I was already using Thomas Jefferson education philosophy with my own kids to homeschool them, and also in classes that I was teaching. And when I started to do research, I found so much evidence to back up the ages that the Thomas Jefferson education or leadership education assigns to the different phases. And they don't talk about a lot, the DeMills don't talk a lot about the psychology behind those different ages, but there is a lot of evidence that they really nailed those ages. And so I found that really fascinating. So I'm going to do a very quick, 5 minutes of psychology. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to talk about why it's important between 6 and 14 years old. And a lot of times the Thomas Jefferson education materials will say 8 to 12 years old. I have seen precocious kids at 6 and 7 years old who are ready to do, to foster these love of learning areas. And I have seen kids, it's more in boys than girls, as old as 14 who still haven't quite finished this foundational stage. I really find that it correlates with puberty. And that's why I think with boys, it can happen a little bit later. It's not about how smart the kids are. There are actual physiological changes in the brain that happen with puberty. And those changes in the brain help the child move from a foundational concrete stage into a more scholarly stage. So you also kind of have to watch your kids and see where they are developmentally. But Erik Erikson is a psychologist. I think that that's really funny. His parents named him Eric when his last name was Erikson, but that's their prerogative, right? He discovered that people pass through social emotional stages that are linked to their age and their brain development. And at each stage, they emerge having acquired one of two dominant ways of thinking about themselves and thinking about the world. And his stage that he assigned about age 6 to 12, but like I said, it seems to start, if you really want to talk physiology and psychology together, it really starts after they lose those top 4 teeth. And there's this whole, if you're into Waldorf, there's a whole theory about teaching children to learn and the connection between losing teeth and teaching children to learn. And I'm not an expert in this area, but it has something to do with the hormones and the things that trigger in the brain that tell the body that it's okay for them to lose their baby teeth, also trigger other developments that have to do with cognitive ability and thinking and perception, which I think is fascinating, but it's way over my head. But to me, it makes sense that this goes hand in hand. And then it ends a couple years after they enter puberty because of brain development. So he called this stage industry versus inferiority, meaning they emerge from this stage either with a sense of industry, which goes back to trusting their own initiative and ingenuity, loving learning, having confidence that they can do it, or they emerge with a feeling of inferiority, which are a lot of the traits in the forced learners column, feeling like their thoughts aren't that valuable, that they don't matter. Now, even though, and I keep saying this because I know a lot of you listening have older kids, even though this is the ages he gave it, if you have a child who's 14, 15, 16, or you as an adult feel like, oh, wow, this is the problem. I developed more inferiority than industry. And it's not a black and white 100% thing either. I think as I've met people and talked to people and just myself, I think that we develop both of these, but one is dominant. And if you feel like the inferiority is what was developed at this phase, you can absolutely correct it. You can correct it for yourself. You can correct it for older children. You can correct it for older students. If you are teaching a class and you've got students who are 12, 13, 14, even up to 16, and you've got students who are kind of giving you a hard time, it's probably because they developed inferiority instead of industry when they were younger. But that's okay, because you can work with that. The reason I think it's important to understand that is because you can't fix something if you don't understand what's broken. If a student did develop industry and they're 15, 16 years old and you're having trouble getting them to do things, but they developed industry, they love learning and they have confidence and strategies, that's when you then start looking at their scholar skills. So then it's, well, okay, maybe their scholar skills are lacking. And we're going to talk about that in later webinars, what those scholar skills are, but we're going to focus on the younger ages today. So why is this important? Well, because if you understand that learners between these ages are very concrete learners, and they have difficulty with abstract or hypothetical concepts. Now, if you have a younger kid who does great with hypothetical or abstract ideas, then that is fine. I remember when I started this years ago, I swore up and down that abstract thinking was not possible before the age of 12. I will tell you, I have met kids who can do it. I've never met a 4-year-old who can do it, but I've met 10 and 11-year-olds who can extrapolate and think hypothetically. So I take back my absolute statements, and you guys know your kids and you know your students and you make your own judgments. But typically until the age of at least 12, kids have a hard time thinking abstractly or hypothetically. So the problem with that is if they are pushed to think abstractly or hypothetically, and this is my main problem with some of the content of Common Core, is that as early as 3rd grade starts to introduce abstract ideas or hypothetical situations and wants the children to respond to those. And the problem is that's not really cognitively in their roundhouse. And if you push them to do something that they are pretty much guaranteed to fail at this age, then that undermines their confidence and it undermines their love of learning. So, and if you have older kids so if you have kids this age, try not to do that. Try to set them up for success. If you have kids who are older, who seem to really have a feeling of no confidence or inferiority, it's okay when they're older to be really honest with them and say, hey, this is something that was done when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and it wasn't that you weren't smart enough to do it. That's just not something your brain was ready to do. You can talk very openly with your kids about these stages and about learning, and just let them know that's not you. It's not a general statement about you. It doesn't mean you weren't smart. You're just not ready. And it doesn't mean you can't do it now, because now your brain is different. So, I'm just really upfront with my kids about learning and stages, and they know all this stuff so that they don't feel like it's not about not being smart or not being good at a certain subject. It's really about figuring out the strategies that work for you and doing appropriate learning activities for you. We don't yell at a 1-year-old who can't tie their shoe. It's just normal that they can't tie their shoe. But we do yell at a 10-year-old who maybe can't do the word problems in math. Well, we don't yell at them, probably, if you're on this, but they might have had a teacher who did that. So it's okay to talk to your kids about that wasn't quite the way to approach it. And, sorry about that, but, just so they're aware that it wasn't them. It's really important to set them up for success. Success in acquiring new skills and knowledge is really vital at this age. But if they didn't have a lot of experience with success, you can set them up for success when they're older. So like I said, maybe you back off of the big giant assignment or the big overwhelming project, and you focus on something smaller so they can have little successes along the way. Also around this age, and this continues into their teenagehood, positive peer interactions are crucial because they get a lot of their feedback. Around the age of 6 to 8, they start to transfer their perception of who they are from their parents to their peers. And so it's very important who those peers are and what kind of interactions they are having. It's very important that you are aware of the kind of interactions that they're having. I think that's important always, even when they're teenagers, but it's very important that at this stage, because they can be affected much more strongly at this age. And actually at this age, if they have positive peer interactions and they develop this sense of industry and confidence, as teenagers, they are less susceptible to negative peer influence. They're the kids who are more willing to tell their teenage peers, no, that's not me. That's not okay. I don't do that. Or, they're less likely to give in to negative peer pressure. So I always say quality over quantity when it comes to groups. So especially if you're a homeschooling parent, a lot of times kids will want social interaction. They want groups, co-ops, group classes, different activities with groups. They are all important, and they become more and more important as your kids get older. But I would always recommend quality over quantity. If you have a group of people who are just great positive influence, but they only meet once a week, then that's when I would meet with them and then do everything that I could to facilitate maybe little informal get-togethers on other days. But throwing kids into a school situation 5 days a week where they're having negative interactions, even if they're getting social, is not a positive thing. Or, if you can only get 3 people for a book group, but those 3 people are really awesome and really good influence on your kids and really good examples, or the parents are really positive and really awesome with the kids and they understand the same principles that you understand, I would say do your book group with 3 people rather than try and get 10 people and compromise who is in your group. And not to say that some people are better than others. I just mean more in alignment with your principles and what you want to accomplish with your kids. Okay, so concrete ideas, and we're almost done. So I talked about all the why it's so important. So here are our last few slides talking about love for learning, building confidence, building strategies. The question I always get when I do live seminars is, okay, so what does that mean? What do we actually do? So here are some ideas. These are not exhaustive, but these are some ideas. Here are some ideas that do foster a love for learning. So if you have kids who don't seem to love learning, here are some things you can do. Reading together is always good. And read from a variety of different types of things. That's actually hard for me because I love fiction and I don't love nonfiction, but there's no way I'm ever going to get my kid to appreciate anything other than fantasy stories if that's all I ever read. And when I say read together, if you have an older kid, then you can still read to them. Just because they already know how to read doesn't mean you don't read to them. And if you take the time to read with an older kid and then also talk about the story, that can really foster a love for learning because it creates a lot of positive emotions surrounding reading. So if they hate reading, even if they can read, I will read to them. Reading aloud to them is completely different than putting them on an audiobook. There's a completely different emotional response. I still read aloud to my 13-year-old who can read just fine. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay. So somebody said their husband, she sent it to me privately, but I'm going to share it anyway, read to the kids until they left for college. I read with one of my girls, I read to her really, really late. I mean, even she probably would still read with me. I read with my husband when we were first married. We would have to drive from San Diego up to Los Angeles, and rather than listen to the radio or do other stuff, we would actually bring books and we would read to each other, or a lot of times he would drive and I would read, and he loved that. It created so much positive feelings, so many positive feelings associated with that. And I still think about some of the books that we read together, and they were just, fun fiction books, but I just feel really happy when I think of those stories, not because they were great books necessarily, but because I had that experience, I shared that experience. So reading together is hugely powerful. If you have a kid who you're asking them to read something and you're not willing to take the time to sit down and read it with them or to them, then that might be why they don't want to read it either. Making up stories together. This is a little bit more for younger kids, but if you have kids who are kind of stumped and they're older, they can do this too. But writing stories about your own childhood or telling them stories about your own childhood, they love that. Yes, the recording folder will have the slides as well as a recording of this video, so you'll get that. Don't worry, don't be frantically taking notes. Just enjoy the webinars in your pajamas. So making up stories, I mean, it really just kind of connects everything and makes it personal. Showing them, as far as math and science, showing them where you see that, just as you're kind of out for the day, so that math and science don't become these things that live in textbooks only when they have to study and they're boring and flat. Just continuing to keep things personal. Lots of hands-on experiments, especially if you're talking about the 6 to 14-year-olds. Remember, they're very concrete, especially between 8 and 12. They're very concrete. So a lot of hands-on things, projects. Don't be afraid to get messy. I say that because I hate messy projects. I'm that homeschool mom who didn't want to do all the crazy craft projects. I looked for every co-op and homeschool friend who was willing to get really messy, and I just sent my kids that way because I'm so not that crafty mom. But I do appreciate how important it is. But it really helps them. But even if you have older kids who are having a hard time, so my dad loves World War II. He can also talk your ear off about the Civil War and World War I, but he really, really loves World War II. And one of the things that he loves to do is to go to classes that are taught by friends of mine or other teachers I know, and he goes and he takes his World War II memorabilia. A lot of times they go to his house because some of it can't be transported. And he has detailed models of U-boats that the Germans used in World War II. He has all kinds of weapons. He has goggles from Japanese pilots. Amy has taken classes over to his house. This is, I think, more fun for my dad than it is for the kids. But these kids are 13 to 15 years old. I think we've even done it with classes as old as 16-year-olds. And it can be really transformational even for the older kids. So even the kids who can think abstractly and they're reading these awesome stories about the war and the people in the war, but when they see pictures of a whole squadron of Japanese pilots that was taken hours before they were all shot down, and they see goggles and they see the actual model of the boats and the different weapons, and it really brings it home to them and helps them understand, and it really renews their interest in then going back and reading about these periods or writing about these periods. So even if kids are older, sometimes making it concrete can really help you. If you've got a kid who's really reluctant, see what you can do about getting them a hands-on experience. You can get them a kit. They can build their own U-boat if they're really good at that. So, I mean, whatever works for your kids. I like to refer a lot to maps and globes and really show them, because I think sometimes when we're reading stories or even history, kids think it's a story, and when you show them, no, look, this happened here, or the history about where you live. Wherever you live, there's some kind of history. I live in Southern California. We have a lot of missions. We have a lot of naval ships parked pretty close to where I live, and actually exploring the history where you live. But I know that history exists all over the place. So exploring history just so they can just see concretely, oh, this is real. I mean, even going to war memorials and seeing the names and seeing the real, putting faces and names to the stories. Going together, don't, even if they're older, don't send your teenagers off to concerts and theater and museums, go with them so that you can then have a conversation about it. I still go to plays with my 17-year-old daughter. You can take a class together. I've had friends who took community college classes with their teenagers, a lot of times in like a foreign language, but you could take a class in anything. And then not only are you taking the class together, but you're modeling the learning process. You're showing them that you're still learning. And then they have a study buddy who can help them. But all of these things, the theme I hope you see, and the thread through all of these, is really about creating positive emotional connections to learning. So the way you foster love for learning, the bottom line is you create a positive experience for them with learning. So whatever that would be for your child, what's important to them, and they are very connected to you. Even when they're teenagers, they're still connected to you, even though they protest differently, and they do care, and they do, it's still impactful to do things with them. So how do you build their confidence? Taking turns choosing what to read. That might sound silly to some of you, but it's so important because, like I talked about earlier, you want them to feel like their ideas are valid. So I would always take turns with my kids, and of course I always picked these really classic books. Some of them were a little wordy and a little stuffy, but I read them aloud, so my kids kind of put up with me. And then when it was my kid's turn, I have one, my son, every time it was his turn, he would pick Kingdom Keepers, and that's a series that Disney commissioned somebody to write. I don't even think it's one author, but it's a series of books that take place in the Disney World parks. Each book is set in a different park. So, and then I think one book is set on the Disney cruise ship. And they're not horrible books. They're just not great literature. And my background is in literature, so I was not thrilled to be reading these books. And they're kind of long, but he really liked these books. And so it was really important to him. And so I would read my classic to him, and then it was his turn, and I would read his Kingdom Keepers to him, and we would talk about that story too. But that just helps them build their confidence that their choices are valid, and you want to do that. That'll become important later. Give them lots. Writing is such an important skill they're going to need their whole life. But when they're starting out, if they're reluctant writers, just let them write. I say the same thing for reading. Every human, no matter what they do for the rest of their life, needs to have the skills of reading and writing. They need to be able to read information, and they need to be able to communicate in writing. That's just the world that we live in. But if they are reluctant to either one of those, then you start with whatever reading or writing they're willing to do. So the only exception to that personally for me is reading that is actually the books that are bent, books that have morals or messages in them that are negative or that are not okay for kids. That's where I draw the line. And you can decide which books those are. It's interesting. My kids really loved Junie B. Jones. My girls really loved Junie B. Jones. And I have talked to many mothers who hate Junie B. Jones with a passion because they think that the character is really bratty. And so they weren't willing to let their kids read Junie B. Jones because they didn't want them thinking that was a cute character. And that is absolutely fine. It's up to you, whatever you think. I don't like, there's a book that's really popular that I don't like. Oh, I can't think of what it is now. Because I think the main character is just kind of not a nice guy. So I do, draw the line for yourself and for your own kids at ideas that you would consider actually damaging. So don't let them read that. But don't worry if it's fluff, because it's still reading. And you can, once they're not afraid of reading, once they have confidence, once they learn to love reading or at least appreciate reading, then you can kind of slowly move them into something meatier. My son was a really reluctant reader. I taught him how to read. He didn't have any difficulties reading, which was kind of nice because my child before him has dyslexia, and she was very hard to teach to read, and we actually had to take her to a specialist. It was outside of my ability, but he got it. He understood how to read probably pretty early. He just had no interest. So I just kept doing the lessons with him, and that was fine. He finally, when he was around 11, got really hooked on Dungeons and Dragons, and suddenly he wanted to read, but all he wanted to read is Dungeons and Dragons manuals. And that was fine content-wise for me. My husband is a big D&D fan, and so I was okay with that. If you're a parent, you might want to preview it. Everyone has different ideas, but so I was okay with the content. They're written for adults. They're not written for kids, so they're not easy reading, and they have a lot of made-up names for creatures and places and things, and so he really had to use those phonics skills that I had been teaching him for years, because he had to really break down and sound out these words. And so he did it. He worked really hard because he really wanted to read these books. So he worked really hard. By contrast, my oldest daughter, the books that inspired her were Macbeth and Jane Eyre. So, every kid's different. So he really liked D&D, and that was fine. I let that go for a while, and he read those books. He would carry them around in his backpack, and these are heavy, big hardcover books, and he would carry them around in his backpack, and he would read them everywhere we went. And I love that he's breaking out a D&D book instead of a video game, as we're sitting places waiting for things. But then over time, I steered him toward like the Narnia books and the Fablehaven books. And right now we're actually reading King Arthur, the original Mallory King Arthur books, not in Middle English. We're reading a translation. But so I just let him explore what he was interested in, and I let him choose. And when I felt like he was ready for it, I started introducing classics that had similar ideas or similar elements in them. So that, and he's really enjoying the classic King Arthur stories. So I read a lot. This is all, I skipped one, and this is always a little controversial. When I do this live, I can actually see parents like roll their eyes, like, you must be crazy. And so do not correct spelling or grammar unless asked. That makes parents and teachers so nervous. And I am an English teacher, and trust me, spelling and grammar mistakes, they physically hurt me, I feel like. So now, this doesn't mean don't teach spelling and grammar. So my kids always did little, so my kids I have one kid who's a total spelling grammar, she actually loves it, and she would do pages and pages of the little worksheets. But my kids who hate it, you can actually buy on Amazon. They're called Daily Practice, and teachers use them, and they're only half a page, so they're really small. And if you just do like one of those a day, and if your kid's having a bad day, then just skip that day. But they do slowly kind of build. Really, what builds spelling and grammar is reading. So if you can foster a love for reading, and you can get your kids reading, then that is really what teaches grammar and spelling. It takes a lot longer, or we would play games, like we would play Mad Libs to learn about grammar. So my kids only know noun, adverb, verb, adjective because of Mad Libs. Frankly, as an adult, even as an English teacher, I have never needed to dissect a sentence, but I need to know what a complete sentence is. But I know that because I read. So yeah, and somebody was saying that her daughter listening to her dictate, then she understands. Now that we have texting, when I text my children, my grammar and my spelling is always correct. I never abbreviate anything, or I never leave out the grammar when I'm texting, and my kids laugh at me for that. But too bad, I'm leading by example. But the reason that I say not to correct their spelling or grammar unless they ask, for one thing, remember, we are kind of focusing on younger kids. So if you've got a 17-year-old writing a college admissions essay, they probably need their grammar and their spelling checked. However, if you've got a 17-year-old kid writing a college admissions essay, they're probably asking you to check for spelling and grammar. I mean, my older kids ask. So the other thing is, have a little faith. They will ask. Kids know that spelling matters. Kids know certain words are spelled certain ways, and if they can't spell anything, then other people can't read their writing. So rather than hammering them on grammar and spelling, I just model and explain the importance of, I have these really cool ideas, but I can't share those ideas with other people if I can't express them in a way that they can decode. My oldest daughter really, really loved writing plays when she was young. And she would write these elaborate scripts, and there were no spaces between the words, and there was no punctuation. Her spelling was pretty good, but they were just crammed onto these papers. And she would hand them out to her friends, and her friends would look at them and without being mean, they would just say, where I don't understand where my line starts. I don't understand. So she learned that she couldn't share her really cool ideas until she learned some conventions. And then she came to me and said, hey, can you help me figure out how to format this so that my actors can read my plays? And so I did. So I promise they will eventually ask. If they don't ask and they go off to college and they have never asked and they can't spell and they can't do grammar, let the college break that to them, that that's not okay. By the time they're that age, they're a little more resilient anyway, so they can take it. So I really, really mean it. Don't correct that. That doesn't mean don't teach it, but maybe like play games or do funny little things. But if they come to you with a story they wrote and they're so proud, the absolute worst thing you can do is say, oh, this is great, and then start fixing their spelling. Because that just will crush them. Confidence and love of learning out the window. Reading a lot of stories about historical figures, especially mathematicians and scientists. I love mathematicians and scientists because the really great ones failed more than they succeeded. And kids need to know about those failures. Kids need to know that Disney got fired from his first cartooning job and that he went bankrupt once. And kids need to know that Edison failed more experiments than were successful, because they need to, a lot of times kids take failure as a sign that they shouldn't do that. Even adults take failure as a sign that, well, maybe I shouldn't pursue that. And sometimes that is what it means, but sometimes it just means that you need to find a different route, or you need to try a different way, or you need to just hang in there and keep going. So they need to hear those stories about people they look up to. They tend to think, Einstein was just smart the whole time and nothing ever went wrong for him. And Edison, invented all these things and nothing ever went wrong. And they need to know that that's not how it works. And then allow them to explore topics that interest them. And also introduce topics that maybe they don't know about. Sometimes parents will tell me, well, my kid's not interested in anything. And, or I ask them and they can't come up with anything. Well, that might be because they just don't have a huge, library, so to speak, to draw from. Especially younger kids, they don't know what the world has to offer. And that's part of your job as a mentor, is to show them what the world has to offer and what kinds of things might be interesting to them. They don't know if they're interested in something unless they even know it exists. So always introducing new activities, new ideas, new topics, but not in a way that forces them, but just in a way like, oh, you like, and I usually try to connect it to something. I'll say, oh, well, you like this. You might also like this. And I try to do that. But sometimes I just say, hey, we're going on an adventure. Let's go see if we like hiking. Let's go see if we like exploring this. My 17-year-old daughter was talking to her little brother the other day, and she is trying to decide where she wants to go on a service trip next year. And so as she was looking at the website that lists, they send teenagers to locations all over the world, and she's looking at the list and trying to figure it out. She was telling me that she was naming all these places to him, and she was asking him, hey, would you want to go to Argentina? Would you want to go to Europe? Would you want to go to Africa? And he kept saying no. And she kept going down the list. She was just curious. And finally she got to Lima, Peru. And he's like, wait, what? And she was reading the little description, because they, the group that this organization takes, they do service most of the time, but they also get to do some touristy things. And in Lima, Peru, they explore some ancient sites that my son has heard about and is interested in. And so he was like, oh, I think I would want to go there. That sounds really cool. I'd like to see that for myself. So, I mean, it would never have occurred to him to come to me and say, I want to do this service project thing in Lima, Peru. But because she went through the list basically and said, hey, did you know? So sometimes kids just don't know what the world has to offer. And that's part of our job, is to show them what the world has to offer. But in a way that's just like, and she never said anything bad, as he said no to like 20 places until she finally found one that was interesting to him. So not in a way that forces, but in a way that just shows them what's out there. Okay, almost the last slide. And I'll let you all go and you can take showers and get dressed for the day. What do I mean by strategies? So this is basically teaching them how to learn. The idea is, if we do this right before they're 12, when they are 12, 13, 14, they really kind of take over their education, which is wonderful for us. It is really, really nice to have a kid who kind of takes charge of their education as a teenager, and they still need us. My kids still needed me. There were things they simply couldn't facilitate because they were too young or they didn't know how, but they really took charge of what they were learning, and they had a lot of basic strategies about how to learn it. So this just some things that build strategies. So strategies just means sort of a toolbox of, if you want to learn something, do you know how to learn it? And strategies are so much more important than content. In fact, I would say you use the content as your vehicle to teach strategies, not the other way around. And so one last story I'll give you as an example. My oldest, when she was in high school, we knew she really liked science, and we knew she wanted to study really hard science in college. Like, she was talking about neuroscience or cognitive development, but from a physiological standpoint, all things that are way hard for me. But she was really interested. And we told her in high school, during her high school years, you really need to take another chemistry class. She had taken chemistry, but she was really young. She started high school young, and she took chemistry, and I didn't feel like a lot of it sunk in because she just was young and she didn't quite have the math skills. So she struggled through it. She thought it was really interesting, but I didn't feel like she really learned it at the level that she needed. So my husband and I suggested to her she needed another year of chemistry before she went off to college. And she said, okay. And then at the last minute decided no, she didn't want to do that. And we said, okay. So she went off to college and enrolled in a chemistry class because that's what she needed for what she wanted to study. And she went to the first two classes, and she called me really upset because she said, I do not understand what she's talking about. And I don't understand. There wasn't even a textbook. The teacher gave them what do you call them? Educational journal entries. So when people are working on their PhD and they're writing journals, journal entries, they're writing papers on their personal experiments. That's what the teacher gave them to read. And they were so over her head. And she was really lost. And so I just stopped for a minute. I said, okay, so what do you need to do? And quitting the class was not something she was willing to do. And so I said, okay, so what do you need to do? So we went back to strategies. If you need to learn something, what are some ways you can learn? So we talked about, reading a book, taking a class. Okay, the book was over her head, or the reading was over her head. She was already in the class, but she was struggling. Asking an expert, getting out, personal help. So she went to the teacher. And she admitted to the teacher, I don't feel like I have the foundation for this class, but I really want to take it. Can you recommend a book or some other reading that's a little more foundational that I could read on top of my assignments for class to really build up my knowledge or refresh my memory, because I did take it, but it was a long time ago. So she went to the teacher and admitted that she needed more of a foundation and asked for recommendations. The teacher was really happy to give her those recommendations. I think it probably took her double the effort to pass that class than any of her other classes. And I was so proud of myself that I resisted the urge to say I told you so, because I didn't. But it was a really great lesson for her. But because she had those strategies in place and she had the confidence and she knew she could do it, she just needed to talk to me and kind of touch base and review what was in her power to do. It really made a difference. I have seen kids quit because they don't have the strategies. And so when it feels overwhelming, they just feel like, well, I must just not be smart enough for this class, or I can't take this right now, or I can't learn this right now, or I'm never going to learn this. And so they quit, and we don't want them to quit. I mean, there is a time to quit if they're really that over their head, or they've taken on a lot more than they can manage. Then, that's a whole nother skill, understanding when to say no and boundaries. But a lot of times, if they just go back to basic strategies, okay, how do I learn things? What are ways to learn things? I can read. I can form a study group. When I was in college, I minored in French. I didn't really have a choice. I majored in literature, and the college I went to required that you minor in the literature in a whole other language. And so I had to take 3 upper division literature classes in French. The teacher lectured in French. I was supposed to take notes in French. I mean, you had to be fluent. And most of the kids in this class were native speakers. And I had 3 years of French and still felt like I could barely understand it. So I was really struggling, but I couldn't quit because I wasn't willing to change my major. So I went around and talked to all the different kids in the class, and I found 3 or 4 kids who were willing to be in a study group with me, which was so nice of them, because I didn't feel like I really had a lot to offer them in the study group. I really needed them. But it did help them to help me, because it helped them. Anytime you teach, you learn, right? So I formed this study group, and I did not quit, and I passed that class. I didn't get an A, but I passed that class, and I got to major in what I wanted. So, I mean, all these different things about how do you learn, teaching kids how to learn. One really important thing, if you go down where it says, help them break down big ideas and big projects into manageable chunks. Sometimes we just get the end project thrown at us. Teachers won't necessarily break it down for us, or just life doesn't break it down for us. But helping them look at things in chunks, or breaking them down into manageable pieces, and just focusing on getting through each piece one at a time, and not looking at the whole giant task, is a huge skill. It helps their confidence. And for one thing, if they can break it down and they can do each little part successfully, then they have a lot of little successes, which, again, a lot of psychology studies have shown that having a series of little successes is actually more impactful than having one huge success. So it's great for them if they can break things down and have a lot of little successes. That's actually really good for them, and it's a great skill to have. And, things like, and I tried to hit on reading and writing, science. The whole point of science, until your kid is like in graduate school curing cancer, it's really not content driven. It's really about learning how to think and learning how to hypothesize and learning scientific method. Same thing with math. Why do we study math? It's not so we can pass the SAT. I mean, passing the SAT, getting a good score on the SAT is a really good idea, but if you want to go to certain colleges. But really, math trains our brain to think. So when they understand that, that really helps them understand the strategy behind what they're learning, which connects to loving learning and building confidence. And just teaching them there are different strategies. Then I think it's in 2 webinars. I'm going to talk about learning styles, and I do a lot more than just the basic learning styles. I talk about a lot of different aspects of how people learn and also their personality types and how that impacts how they learn. But teaching kids that there's a lot of different ways to learn, and just because your best friend can read a book and remember every word or is really good at writing and it's really easy for them, that doesn't mean they're better than you. It just means they learn differently than you. So don't worry about how they learn. Let's figure out how you learn. Maybe you need to build something. Maybe you need to see it visually. So creating, maybe I had a student for years, really artistic student, and almost all of her assignments for my English class were these very elaborate sketches and paintings, and they were beautiful and they were very detailed, and they absolutely demonstrated that she understood the novel or the theme or whatever it was that we were learning about. She did that through art instead of, she did have to write a few essays here and there, but she did a lot of things visual, you know. So helping your kids understand that not only that there are different learning strategies, but each one is valid, and having, the world seems to reward people who have a very literacy-based learning style, which is reading, writing, and discussing. People who are good at reading, writing, and discussing, the world in general tends to label them as smart. And there are some very, very smart people who are very kinesthetic learners, project-based learners. So just letting your kids know that those are all valid, and you're not less smart or more smart based on what strategy you use. Just figure out what strategy works for you and then use that strategy. All right, I'm going to leave you with this quote from Galileo: "You cannot teach a person anything, you can only help him find it within himself." This is why these ideas are so important, that it's not about the content, it's really about helping them love learning and building their confidence and giving them just some strategies that they can use with any content, because you cannot force someone to learn. You can try, and you just end up with a really unhappy person, and they probably don't retain much of what you force them. But you can help them find it in themselves. So thanks, and I will see you next Saturday.